So after a brief diversion from our sermon series, we are back at it, looking at the bad boys and girls of the Bible. If you missed any of the sermons in this series, they are posted on our website, and so you're welcome to check that out and catch up if you need to. We've been looking at various characters from the Bible who are people of questionable character and people who we can learn something from. 2 Sundays ago, we looked at Lot, and this Sunday we're looking at Lot's wife. So I'm picking up the story that Joshua read. I'm picking it up at chapter 19, verse 15, and continuing on through verse 26. When dawn broke, the messengers urged Lot, "Get up and take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, so that you are not swept away because of the evil in this city." He hesitated, but because the Lord intended to save him, the men grabbed him, his wife, and 2 daughters by the hand, took him out, and left him outside the city. After getting them out, the men said, "Save your lives, don't look back, and don't stay in the valley. Escape to the mountains so that you are not swept away." But Lot said to them, "No, my lords, please. You've done me a favor and have been so kind to save my life. But I can't escape to the mountains. Since the catastrophe might overtake me there, I would die. This city here is close enough to flee to, and it's small. It's small, right? Let me escape there, and my life will be saved." He, one of the angels, said to Lot, "I'll do this for you as well. I won't overthrow the city that you have described. Hurry, escape to it. I can't do anything until you get there." That is why the name of the city is Zoar. As the sun rose over the earth, Lot arrived in Zoar, and the Lord rained down burning asphalt from the skies onto Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord destroyed these cities, the entire valley, everyone who lived in the cities, and all of the fertile land's vegetation. When Lot's wife looked back, she turned into a pillar of salt. May God add understanding and blessing to the reading of these words. So 2 Sundays ago, when I introduced Lot to you, I said that his story was like a tragic novel. But that was before we even got to this part of the story, right? Well, Lot's life was full of bad choices, as we learned 2 Sundays ago. And what we see in today's text is just how tragic those choices were, not just for him, but also for his family, and especially for his wife, who, interestingly enough, is nameless in the text. But if we think his story is tragic, hers is even worse. Because in addition to being nameless, her life, and especially her death, are a mystery. Which means in order to understand her and why she is important, we have to use our imaginations, or the imaginations of others. Now, there are several camps in terms of trying to interpret the scripture, and one is the traditional interpretation. The traditionalists would have you believe, or have us believe, that her death was due to her disobedience, even though she wasn't the only one who was disobedient. When the angels told Lot to pack up and leave town, he didn't do it right away. He dilly-dallied until the angels finally grabbed him and forcefully escorted him and his family outside the city, saying, "Leave now, and whatever you do, don't look back." Well, then Mrs. Lot looked back. And for that, she was turned into a pillar of salt, the traditionalists say. Even though Lot had the impertinence to dilly-dally when the angels said to leave, even though he had the audacity to try to negotiate with them in terms of his final destination, even though he was as much to blame for their situation as anyone, the argument goes that because she disobeyed, Mrs. Lot was the one who was punished after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Furthermore, the argument goes, she stands as an example to the rest of us on what not to do. Now, to be clear, this particular explanation has been accepted for years, decades, maybe even millennia. And it's been touted by preachers and religious educators alike to prove what a bad idea it is to disobey God. In fact, Rebecca Goldstein, who is an American novelist and publisher, once shared how, as a child, this story scared her silly. She said, Lot's wife was told not to look, but she looked anyway, and her punishment came swift and horrible. And when I asked my second grade Hebrew school teacher, but why did she look? The teacher said, it doesn't matter. God said not to look, and she looked. She thought she could get away with it, but of course she couldn't. Nobody can get away with anything because God sees all. Now, if that doesn't put the fear of God in a 7-year-old, I don't know what would. Well, in addition to sucking the air out of the room, this traditional interpretation also has a number of flaws. First, it assumes a lot about Mrs. Lot that quite simply is not in the text. For example, it assumes that she wanted to stay in Sodom, that she was happy there and she loved her life. And since Lot was rich, it's also safe to assume they lived high on the hog, which means, in turn, we assume that she had lots of stuff and that she didn't want to lose her stuff. This argument also assumes that she had friends in Sodom that she didn't want to leave behind. And all of this assumes that she was angry with God because God was making her leave her home. Now, to me, that's an awful lot of assuming. And you know what happens when we assume, right? There are a lot of assumptions in there just to prove that Mrs. Lot was defiant and that she knowingly disobeyed God. This interpretation further assumes that Mrs. Lot, heard God's command, and that she chose to look anyway, even though the command was, don't look back. And therefore, the argument goes, she got what she deserved. Well, but Dana Nolan Fuel and David Gunn point out in their book called Gender, Power, and Promise that we cannot make this assumption. After analyzing the Hebrew grammar in verse 17, they show how the verse is in masculine singular form. This means that when the angels said, flee for your life, they were referring to Lot's life. And when they said, don't look back lest you lose your life, they meant his life. There you can see their analysis there. Clearly, the angels were only concerned with Lot, not with the rest of his family. But we English speakers, we read it as plural. And so we assume that the angels were concerned for both. We also assume that Mrs. Lot heard the command and chose to disobey. But it ain't necessarily so. Then there's fatal flaw number 3, and that is the assumption that Mrs. Lot was evil, or that she was at least under the influence of evil. Now, this is an argument that we've seen before when we considered one very bad girl named Eve, remember? This assumption is also evident in several works of art. Like this painting, it's kind of hard to see, but if you go out and do a Google search on Rubens' The Flight of Lot, you'll find this and you'll have a much clearer image. It was painted by Peter Paul Rubens in 1625. And here we see the family leaving the city while evil-looking demons are flying up above. And one of them is even staring at Mrs. Lot. The implication being that Mrs. Lot was influenced by those demons, and her choice in turn to turn back and look was rooted in that evil. Now, how Mr. Rubens got all of that from the one verse that we have in the text about Mrs. Lot is beyond me. But it does demonstrate how faulty assumptions can lead us to false impressions. Now, granted, if it weren't for this traditional perspective, Mrs. Lot wouldn't be considered a bad girl at all, and we probably wouldn't be talking about her today. In fact, we might even instead see her as an unfortunate victim instead of a woman of questionable character. But for many of us, perhaps some of you, this traditionalist perspective does nothing to offer us hope. And quite frankly, to me, that's one of the things that the Bible is supposed to do, is offer us hope. So where can we find the hope in this story? How might we interpret it in an essence of hope? And what might we learn when we do that? Well, thankfully, there are several sources that can help us do just that. For example, in one particular Jewish midrash, written by an 8th century rabbi, Lot and his wife, who the rabbis, by the way, give her a name, it's Idit. She and Lot have 4 daughters instead of just 2. 2 of them are married to sodomite men, and 2 were unmarried virgins, the ones that were offered up by their father to the mob, which was a questionable choice in itself. When Lot warned his sons-in-law that Sodom would be destroyed, the text tells us that they thought he was joking, and the implication is that they stayed behind. But Idit, like any good mother, worried about her 2 married daughters, and she hoped that they might escape. And so as she was running with her husband and her other 2 daughters, she glanced behind her in hopes that she would see her other 2 daughters out of love and concern for them. And that, according to the rabbis, was when she saw the divine presence of the Holy One, which was expressly forbidden, and as a result was turned into a pillar of salt. Now, another argument comes from a 20th century women's commentary called The 5 Books of Miriam. And in that particular commentary, we hear a melancholy side of Mrs. Lot, something a little different, written as if she were speaking for herself. It says, "I looked back at all that I had left behind, my friends and relatives, my home with its cherished mementos, my childhood, and I wept. And so hot was the desert sun and the brimstone torching Sodom that my flowing tears dried instantly and turned me into a pillar of salt." So that's yet another interpretation that we can look at. And a third one is a poem written by the late Christine Beatty, where we hear yet another perspective of a woman in conflict with her human and spiritual selves. Here I've extracted a part of that poem for you. While Lot, the conscience of a nation, struggles with the Lord, she struggles with the housework. In the morning, when he tells her of the judgment, that is God's decision to destroy the city, she puts down the lamp she is cleaning and calmly begins to pack. In between bundling up the children and deciding what will go, she runs for a moment to say goodbye to the herd, gently patting each soft head with tears in her eyes for the animals that will not understand. She smiles blindly to the woman who held her hand at childbed. It is easy for eyes that have always turned to heaven not to look back. Those who have been by necessity drawn to earth cannot forget that life is lived from day to day. Good to a God and good in human terms are 2 different things. On the breast of the hill, she chooses to be human and turns in farewell and never regrets the sacrifice. How many of us have chosen to be human and looked back at what we are leaving behind? In 2005, after my father passed away, my sisters and I sold our parents' house. This is a picture of it here in California. We moved into that house in 1961. I was 3 years old at the time, and I lived there until I graduated from high school at age 18. And quite frankly, it was the only place that I knew of as home. It was where my mother taught me how to bake and sew. It was where my father tried to teach me how to fix a sprinkler head. It was where I terrorized my older sister and where I experienced many, many firsts. So even though we knew it was the right thing to do, selling that house was hard for me because it was the house that I grew up in. And I remember after we had done all the cleaning and the house was completely empty, after we had cleaned out all the closets and all the bedrooms and even my dad's garage, which, took about 3 days. As I started to drive away, I really couldn't help myself because as I cried, leaving the street, I couldn't help it but go around the block just to take one more look at the house that I would never set foot in again. As humans, we are driven by emotion. And we are attached, we get attached to people, to lifestyles, and yes, even to stuff. And when we have to let go, whether involuntarily or not, it's hard for us to say goodbye, especially to the people and the things that we love. And Mrs. Lot, she was human too. And she deserves the benefit of the doubt. Yes, it is possible that she was evil or selfish or defiant, but it might also be possible that she was compassionate and caring and loving. She could have looked back out of curiosity or regret. Or it could have happened by accident when she knelt down to fasten the strap on her sandal. She could have looked back out of loneliness or shame or anger or even a desire to disobey. But in the end, it really didn't matter because her fate was still the same. So that, in my mind, begs the question, was her death homicide or suicide? Was it an act of God or an unfortunate accident? Was it divine intervention or was she the one who was in control? If looking back was an accident, if she didn't hear or know the rule not to look back, or if she was being punished for having disobeyed God, it was homicide. God killed her, which I'm sure makes us all a little bit uncomfortable. And it also raises a whole lot more questions, which I promise I won't go into because we would be here all day. Just one day, yes. I would try to keep it down. But if God agreed to save Lot's life, why then kill his wife? Why kill her instead of him, a man who had little or no regard for his family? And why does it look like God abandoned her? And could that happen to us? But if her death was of her own doing, in essence, suicide by cop, why did she believe that that was the only option? Was she wary of embracing an uncertain future? Did she think that death was better than giving up her old life? Was she so mad at her husband for offering up their daughters to a mob that she could not bear the thought of staying married to him one more day, and suicide was her only way out? We don't know. And quite frankly, we'll never know. Because the Bible doesn't tell us so. Which leads me to another question, and it was actually a question that came up during Bible study last week. Why is this story even here? If understanding this story depends on varying levels of interpretation, some of which are based on faulty assumptions, then why should we take it seriously? I'll tell you why. Because it is a story that ultimately can offer us hope. It's a teachable moment that can help us grow in our faith, but only when we consider it within the context of other sections of Scripture. Let me explain. First, in order to do this, we need to continue the story from Genesis 19, starting with verse 29. There we find what's left of the family, Lot and his 2 daughters, living in a cave. And his daughters, afraid that they won't be able to fulfill their duty as women, which means having babies, decide to, in biblical terms, lay with their father so that they can get pregnant. And they do. And they both have sons, and they name them. The older one names her son Moab. The younger one names her son Ben-Ami, who become the patriarchs of the Moabite and the Ammonite tribes. So why is this important? Because Ruth, who we find in the book of Ruth, was a Moabite. She was descended from Moab. And when Ruth married Boaz, she gave birth to a son named Obed. And he had a son named Jesse, who had a son named David, who became the king of Israel. Then David's son Solomon had a son named Rehoboam, who also had a son, who also had a son, who also had a son. And many, many generations later, their descendant Jacob had a son named Joseph, who, guess what, became the earthly father of Jesus. You see how that works? Even in our messiness, our human messiness, God blesses us. Which is in essence what Paul wrote to the church in Rome. And here is what he wrote. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. In spite of his failings, Lot was a righteous man. He tried to do the right thing by extending hospitality to 2 strangers, who we find out were really angels from God. Yeah, he made some questionable choices. Okay. He made some really bad choices. But he still loved God. He still worshiped God. And I'd like to believe that his wife loved and worshiped God too. I'd like to believe that her death had more meaning than just don't try to get away with anything because God sees it all. And in Luke 17, verse 32, Jesus reminds us to remember Lot's wife. Now, why did he do that? Because it was a teachable moment. He also said that whoever seeks to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. Now, when I put all of this together, put that together with the story of Lot's wife, it gives me hope. And when we layer on top of that Paul's words from Romans 8:28, Mrs. Lot's death takes on new meaning. Because even if she was angry, even if she had anguish, even if she had sadness, whatever emotions she experienced, in spite of her death, her family line lived on. Well into the future, through to the birth of the Messiah. Marrying these things together tells me that in spite of our stumblings, our bad choices, even our humanness, God works to make things good, even in the worst of times. And when we look ahead instead of behind, when we look to the future instead of dwelling on the past, when we look forward instead of looking backward, when we take Jesus' hand and let him lead us to safety, just as Lot's family took the angel's hands and let them lead them to safety. When we walk with Jesus into the future, everything is going to be okay. Or, as we sang a few moments ago, I do not know how long 'twill be, nor what the future holds for me. But this I know, if Jesus leads me, I shall get home someday.